Bouncers of Reddit. Have you ever crossed paths with someone you've had to throw out of a club or bar? How was the experience? I was a bouncer years and years ago. I had to throw out a friend of mine. He didn't pick fights or anything, but was becoming abusive to the staff. When he sobered up he felt really bad about it and came back to apologize. Many years ago one of my relatives got traumatized in college by a horrific incident involving a bouncer and a patron. She was on a first date at a local sports bar and an off-duty bouncer from a different bar or club that knew her date happened to walk in. He came over and said hi and joined them at the table. A bit later a guy the bouncer had ejected before walked up and shot him in the back of the head. My relative said it was an out of nowhere deafening boom and randomly the bouncer's head going flying forward to the table. A few seconds of shock and then people screaming and some running as it sets in. She was in nursing school at the time and mustered what little sense she could and yelled for someone to give her a shirt so she could put it on the back of his head while someone called 911. She told me he lived. Disabled for life but lived. She never went on a date with that first guy again. She knows it wasn't his fault, she just couldn't bring herself to do it. I was interviewed by a guy we had tossed out. I still remember his name because he was such a douchebag that we banned him after this interaction and we all kind of laughed at his name because it fit his behavior so well. Think Kyle Blake. Not his real name, but he has two kind of bro names as first and last. Anyway, fast forward about a year, having finished school, and I'm at a staffing agency to interview for some crappy job. In walks Mr. Blake. Unfortunately, nothing super interesting happened, but throughout the interview he acted a little strange. I never found out if he recognized me, but I was not offered the job. It happened fairly frequently with the regulars. As long as they weren't fighting, they'd be allowed back in the next night. Usually they were pretty embarrassed and apologize for being a drunken jackass. One time I did have to kick out a good friend because he got in a fight. He was in a bad place and was pretty embarrassed by the whole thing. We didn't really talk about it much afterwards. That was over a decade ago, and we are still friends today, and he's settled down and doesn't drink like he used to. Ex-chicken shop worker here. What's that you say? Chicken shop worker? We asked for bouncers. Well, working in a chicken shop in a speepty neighborhood full of lads and iced out boggans means I practically was a bouncer. One night two dudes come in clearly drunk or drugged out. They start discussing what they want. Eventually their conversation grows wild with energy and pure hatred as man 1 argues with man 2 over whether they should get a bunch of chicken nuggets or 2 whole chickens off the rack. This argument turns into a full-on brawl as man 2 presses man 1's face against the Bane Mary, knocking our dear friend Henry the Rooster, a little statue we kept on top of the Bane Mary, onto the floor where he shattered into pieces before my very eyes. Fearing for my coworker's safety I grab man 2 and shove him outside where man 1 eagerly follows, pouncing on his friend. Taking the opportunity he apparently thinks I've opened for him. Locked the store doors, called the police, and watched as man 2 yet again gets the upper hand on man 1 and begins kicking the speep out of him. Funnily enough 2 weeks later I come across man 1 and man 2 in the line at McDonald's. I didn't think they recognized me until I sat down to eat my food and overheard one of them say, "Yo, isn't that the chicken cunt?" After hearing that I promptly left with both direction and magnitude. R.I.P. Henry, you will be missed. I've bounced off and on for about 15 years in the same mid-sized city, about 150k people. One night as people were leaving, this guy sucker punched another patron right inside the door. Several other people quickly got involved. I grabbed Mr. Sucker Punch and he spins around and squares up with me. I guess because I'm tall 6'6", people always seem to try and rush me and wrestle me by the waist. Mr. SP was no different. We end up wrestling for a second before I finally get a solid grip on him. He's still trying to fight at this point. I ended up picking him up and throwing him through the exit doors, breaking one of them off the hinges. About a week later I'm out to eat with my mom of all people, and in walks Mr. Sucker Punch and sits down 2 tables over. I wasn't particularly worried about it, but I really didn't wanna have to beat someone up in front of my mom. About 5 minutes later I see him talking to the waitress, and she makes her way over to our table. That guy over there said you threw him through a door the other night at the bar. He wanted me to tell you he's sorry for being a dumb drunk. Haven't been a bouncer in about 15 years, but funny story from when I was a guy I threw out and had to manhandle roughly. He was trying to hit me, and other people came back the next day, not to start trouble or get in again but merely to apologize and go. Seeing somebody genuinely sorry was a very rare experience. He said, and I quote, "I know I was a bit of a cunt and needed a slap. I know I'm banned. I was off my nut and just wanted to say sorry and no hard feelings." It stuck with me because he really meant it. It really doesn't go like that most of the time. I have a slightly relevant story. My brother went to uni in kind of a rough city. He was at a student bar and watched this guy get bounced. Well, he and the bouncer crossed paths again that night. The guy came back with a chainsaw. Needless to say, he ruined the fun for everyone else, and cops were involved. Bouncer was not injured. He saw. He bounced. Not a bouncer, but a former bartender. I had to call the cops on a couple who had become angry and violent during a Sunday brunch. Both were arrested. The husband threw a glass at me, but the wife started swinging at the cop, so she got the worst of it. Rumor has it the husband was released later that day, but the wife spent a few days in jail. A few weeks later I was in Walmart and spotted the couple. The wife didn't see me, but the husband did. We both walked away in opposite directions without saying a word. But truth be told, I was terrified. Not a bouncer, but an ex-manager, so still had to throw people out. Had one guy come back sober and apologize for his behavior, and actually thank me for throwing him out. Apparently it was a wake-up call for him, not the first time he'd been an aggressive drunk. I didn't see him again after that, so not sure if he actually changed though. I stopped working at that bar a few months after it happened, so even if he did go back, I wouldn't know. Hopefully he did get himself together. I was a bouncer in a higher-end Toronto club in 2000/2001. People were generally respectful and just out to have a fun night. The only real memorable ejection was from a couple we caught having sex in the ladies' washroom. It was very awkward. We had to ensure that it was consensual and ask them to stop, and then escort them out. Because the bathroom facilities were limited to 3 or 4 stalls per gendered washroom, there was a long lineup for the ladies' room. The couple then had to do the walk of shame past the long washroom lineup. They were then escorted from the establishment. Ex-pub manager here. One evening I had a group of drunken young idiots who started a fight in my pub, which needless to say ended up with them getting kicked out. Fast forward a few weeks, and I was having breakfast in a local cafe with one of my bar staff before opening when said group walked in and immediately recognized me. Cue the verbal abuse and threatening behavior, so I finished up and left. But it did not end there. My friend had managed to keep most of the in the cafe. He half knew them, but one strolled out straight up to me and dislocated my jaw with a right hook, followed by several kicks to the back as I went down. Needless to say, that day is why I no longer work in the pub trade. I used to bounce at a club in Annapolis, if you can call throwing drunk spoiled little rich idiots out of the bar bouncing. 3 guys I had thrown out a few weeks prior saw me in a Shoppers grocery store. They started following me, first talking speep and then throwing food at me. I left my cart, walked through the 3 of them, and told them to meet me outside. They called the police, and when the police showed up the 3 stooges didn't leave the store until then. The manager lady nicely and happily explained to the police what they had done, and they were arrested for throwing store items. Never saw them again. I remember one called himself Big Country, a fat sloppy idiot thrown out of the Navy for being a peeping moron. I'm not a bouncer, but in my youth I got thrown out of a bar for taking a picture of my wife. We were young then lol, and were out drinking. They let women dance on the bar some nights. My wife starts doing it, so I snap a pic to show her after. Never in my life have I seen so many bouncers jump onto someone me. I got kicked out. I was able to come back later, after my wife confirmed it was me, her husband taking the photo. I once went to a pub and realized I knew the bouncer from elsewhere. She was a nude model at an art class I attended. I own a small restaurant with a bar and we have 286 people a few times a year. One of them was a regular who just got a little too racist. We all hated him anyways and were just waiting for him to screw up. He did. We had to drag him out. Total scene. I see him all the time. If he's drunk, he will speak to me, but I just walk away. He's a sad, drunk old man who's already filled with misery. Punching him in the mouth wouldn't solve anything. I'm not a bouncer, but I went to school with a guy who became one. Unfortunately for me, he thought I had been banned from the bar he worked at in a case of mistaken identity. But because he knew me, he'd always recognize me if I tried to go in and stop me. I ended up having to go in another time and meet the manager so they'd tell him to stop throwing me out. Been thrown out by bouncers and met them later. They don't care what happens after. That's just their job to do at the time. I used to bartend, and I wouldn't hold any reservations for someone I have kicked out my pub previously. Think it's the same for door staff? I'm not a bouncer, but I've been regular enough as a patron and performer at a particular bar to see people get bounced fairly often. It's the kind of place where most of the patrons are regulars, and a few of them just overindulge sometimes. Most of the time, it's not a problem. They sober up, and when they show up the next weekend and everyone's cool. There was one guy though that got a perma and I'm not even sure what for. But he had been a problem in many ways for a while and he showed up later with a knife. They had to lock the door and call police who found him pounding on the door while everyone was still inside drinking and dancing. That guy eventually got his speep together, but not until spending a few stints in jail and having a couple of restraining orders against him. Former bouncer here. Yes, it has happened. They normally just avoid eye contact. Regular bar hopper here. I got cut off and asked to leave a club a couple times for being too drunk. It was a regular party place for me. Get hired a couple years ago at a serving job and I'm talking to the manager. Just having a chat after the job offer. We both realize we know the other. He was the bouncer who asked me to leave. Had a good laugh about it. We had friends in common too. It was a small city 300,000-ish. A lot of students and the restaurant/club scene wasn't huge. So me working in the industry also meant that the people I partied with were also the bouncers and bartenders that served us. When I was freshly 21 I used to hang out at one of the local bars almost daily. My ex and I were going through a rough breakup and constantly getting coked up and then arguing or getting way too drunk and getting cut off by one of the bartenders. One day he cut me off and I called him a jackass and left no tip, which is extremely uncharacteristic of me. I stopped going to that bar for years because I was ashamed of myself. Several years later and I'm starting a new bartending job and lo and behold, it's the guy I called a jackass who's training me. Since then he's gotten me into another great job and we've actually become quite good friends. Might even start living together. It's a happy ending with a messy beginning. I have thrown many people out of many bars in my lifetime. More often than not, if I encounter them in the wild, they will apologize for that night and whatever happened. I'd laugh, say no big deal, see you soon, and they would come back to the bar eventually. I'd wave, sometimes buy their first drink, and after that they were model patrons. People get drunk and sometimes are assholes, no need to hold a grudge for it. You show them respect while escorting them out and show respect the next time you see them. You will rarely have an issue with them again. Went to a bar once with a few friends and one of my friends was pretty drunk and put his head down on a table. I got up to go have a piss and get stopped by security who tell me to leave because I was falling asleep at a table when it clearly wasn't me. I used to bartend at the time and about a week later the security guy who kicked me out came in and sat at the bar I was working at. I told our security to escort him out for falling asleep at the bar.